What is the actual history of the epic story Les Miserables, and what does it have to do with modern French history in general? We examine both of these questions in this video. We begin with a prayer for France. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Lord Jesus, have compassion on France, and graciously hold it tightly in your love, and show it much tenderness. So ordain things that, full of love for you, it contributes to make you loved in all the nations on earth. O love of Jesus, we now promise to remain always faithful to you, and to work with a heart on fire to spread your reign throughout the universe. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I would appreciate if you could take a moment and click the like button and leave a comment as you watch, subscribe, all that good stuff. So we've already overviewed the entire big history of the Franks and the Frankish people, the French people, the medieval French kingdom. If you want to check out that full examination of the big history of the French people, how they became the eldest daughter of the church, why the papacy moved to Avignon, France, and then how France began to have tensions with the Holy See, the 100 Years' War, all that stuff. Go ahead and check out the previous video on the history of France, and we talked about Jansenism, etc., etc. So a lot of backstory there. This is the thumbnail. In this video, we'll be picking it up again by rediscussing the French Revolution and the relationship between the French Revolution and the famous story Les Miserables, which might just be the greatest story ever written out of French culture, and a deeply Catholic story, ironically written by a non-Catholic. So not without anything that you could object to, of course. It's not like an infallible work, but it is in general a very Catholic story. So we'll be talking about that story at length here and how it actually nestles into church history. So let's review the French Revolution, which is not an element. It's a part of the backdrop of Les Miserables, but it's not in Les Miserables. Les Miserables does not contain the French Revolution. The French Revolution itself began in 1789 when the Third Estate took the tennis court oath, pledging not to separate until France had composed a constitution. The king refused. Soon afterward, on July 14th, a Parisian crowd stormed the Bastille, the royal fortress and prison, which had come to symbolize royal power. The crowd was partly seeking gunpowder and weapons, but the storming of the Bastille itself took on a larger-than-life sort of mythical element, and it became a great symbol of the revolutionary struggle in general. Of course, this revolution was not exactly in favor of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was seen as an element of the Ancien Regime, and the revolutionaries who hoped to establish a republic, perhaps being inspired by their participation in France's participation, that is, and certain soldiers' participation in the American Revolution a couple decades before, hoped to establish a republic that no longer gave any privileges to the church. And as the church defended the old order, the old monarchical order, the revolutionaries despised the church. And also the revolutionaries were heavily inspired by Enlightenment thought and in general rejected the teachings of the Catholic Church as a result of their association with the Enlightenment. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen then announced a new political order based on rights, citizenship, and national sovereignty. Many had hoped for a constitutional monarchy at first, but eventually this turned toward republicanism. And in 1793, Louis XVI, the king, was actually tried and executed, and this began the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre. Revolutionary tribunals executed around 16,000 people by legal sentence for loyalties to the Ancien Regime, and many members of the clergy and religious orders were executed alongside perceived political opponents. It is from the French Revolution that we receive the relatively arbitrary left and right classification system by which all political movements tend to be classified. Baron de Gourville, who was present in the French Assembly as the revolution was brewing, said, quote, "We began to recognize each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair so as to avoid the shouts, oaths, and indecencies that enjoyed free reign in the opposing camp." So the royalists during the pre-revolutionary period aligned themselves on the right side of the assembly, and the libertarians or the republicanists aligned themselves on the left side. That's how we get this notion of the right and left wing. But that notion can be a bit reductionist. It tends to give people the perception that all political parties whatsoever exist on a spectrum between the right and the left, and that's a bit arbitrary. There are, in fact, just different views for how to run a society, different political movements, and they're not necessarily associated on a spectrum. So this notion of right and left wing is a bit arbitrary. Originally, right wing meant you were in favor of the old Catholic order and monarchy, and left wing just meant you were in favor of democracy and a secular society, a sort of Masonic secular society inspired by Freemason ideals, or at least adjacent to Freemason ideals. The National Assembly in 1789 had abolished feudal privileges, including the tithe traditionally paid to the clergy, and all church property, which used to be a major source of income for episcopal, for bishops, as well as for monasteries, was nationalized in 1789 in November. This placed all church lands at the disposal of the state for resale to raise revenue for the government. And this greatly weakens the ability of the church to participate in society once it loses its lands, which had been granted to it for centuries and centuries and centuries by pious, Christians that were, were donating land to the church so that the church could be independent of economic and political powers greater than itself. On February 13, 1790, the Assembly also denied legal recognition to any monastic vows whatsoever. So even though these vows are obviously not, they're not given to the state, they're given to God, and the state can't dispense with them or absolve them, the Assembly legally absolved all monks and nuns of their vows and suppressed all religious orders and encouraged all monks and nuns to take up private lives. It intended on doing this in order to sell monasteries and any lands that they still retained to raise revenue for the government, which was struggling financially. In July 12th, 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy was even more dangerous, or was even more of a threat to the church's rights than taking away its financial means. It reorganized the Catholic Church in France under the revolutionary state. It reorganized parish and diocesan boundaries without Vatican approval or Rome's approval, and it reformed the process by which bishops and pastors were chosen to be a democratic process involving the laity, and this was deemed, of course, as usurping authority from the Pope and the Church. On November 27, 1790, all clergy in France were required to swear an oath to the civil constitution of the clergy, and any that did not were sent into exile or worse. In 1791, Pope Pius VI condemned the civil constitution of the clergy, which led to what you might consider his ultimate martyrdom. He was arrested, and while imprisoned, he died. And that, again, leads us to this execution of many, many clergy. There was a religious uprising in opposition to the revolutionary government in 1793, which contributed to the September 5th beginning of the Reign of Terror in 1793. This was followed by a de-Christianization campaign by the government, which closed many churches and culminated symbolically in the abhorrent November 10th, 1793 Festival of Reason, in which a prostitute was dressed up as a goddess of reason and was worshipped upon the altar of Notre Dame's cathedral. Famously, in 1794, 16 Carmelite nuns were guillotined in Paris. The Reign of Terror ultimately ended in 1794 with the fall of Robespierre. This occurred in the failed revolutionary calendar's month of Thermidor. So there was a Thermidorian reaction. The revolutionaries actually instituted their own calendar to try to replace the traditional Gregorian calendar, which was seen as regulated by the popes. And ultimately, the Reign of Terror ends in the Thermidorian reaction. In 1795, a government called the Directory replaced the regime of Robespierre. It proved corrupt and unstable, however, and Napoleon Bonaparte eventually would end up just simply ruling the government himself In 1799, he overthrew the Directory in the coup of 18 Brumaire. That's just the November 9th. 18th Brumaire is the, again, revolutionary calendar. Napoleon restored order and centralized the state, and he made some peace with the church in the Concordat of 1801, and he issued the Napoleonic Code in 1804, which is still the foundation of France's legal code today. He would crown himself Emperor of the French after some consideration of having the Pope coronate him as Emperor. He would dominate much of Europe after a number of military victories. His empire would weaken, however, after his failures in the Peninsular War in Spain and his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Paris would then fall in 1814, and he would be exiled for the first time. He would return for 100 days in 1815, but after losing the Battle of Waterloo, he would be exiled to St. Helena and would live the rest of his life there until dying in 1821. Napoleon, again, had somewhat more of a warm relationship with the church than the Reign of Terror regime had. However, was still pretty icy. In 1789 and 1798 and 1799, this is before Napoleon, French forces had occupied Rome. They had seized Pope Pius VI, and he died in custody, which might be the reason that so many popes after him chose his name Pius, to symbolize that they intended on standing up to the corrupt, secular, anti-religion governments that were taking over Europe. Napoleon would rise to power after the seizure of Pope Pius VI, but Pope Pius VI died shortly before Napoleon rose to power. Napoleon Bonaparte and Pope Pius VII would sign the Concordat of 1801, which did still give the French government much influence over the church in France, but did restore public Catholic worship and restored some rights to the church's practices and worship. Napoleon would annex the Papal States in 1809, which would certainly sour relations between the church and himself, and Pope Pius VII was also held in French captivity after his conflict with Napoleon. He did not, however, die in captivity, and he would outlast Napoleon and would be seen as a sort of living martyr or willing martyr, as Pope Pius VI was. After Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under King Louis XVIII. He was the brother of the executed Louis XVI. The restoration was meant to return France to a legitimate monarchy and reinstate the Bourbon dynasty after the Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, and royalists hoped that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic years were an aberration in the traditional French order, similar to Cromwell's Republic in British history. But it could not simply erase the 25 years of liberal reforms. Louis XVIII accepted a constitutional charter, and he preserved many Napoleonic legal and administrative reforms. But again, Napoleon returned from exile in 1815, beginning his 100 days of a sort of renewed empire, and many soldiers and former supporters rallied to him, and Louis XVIII fled Paris, but again, he would be reinstated after the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. After Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated again and was exiled to St. Helena, and Louis XVIII was restored a second time. This second restoration of the monarchy placed the Bourbons back on the throne, but his reign was dependent upon foreign military pressure, and there was deep internal division, as there were many Bonapartists who wanted to see a renewed empire and a return of Napoleon to France, as well as many Republicanists who wanted to see a renewed republic. France remained caught between the Royalists, the Republicanists, and the Bonapartists, and this was the tension that we see playing out in the narrative of Les Miserables. So let's consider the story of Les Miserables and its place in French history. We talked in that previous video about why it's useful to look at a key piece of literature in order to better understand the history of a people. So the story of Les Miserables begins with about 100 pages, which might be considered the moral foundation of the entire novel. These pages read like the hagiography of the Bishop of Digne, whose name was Charles François Bienvenu Myriel. He was presented as a member of the nobility who was exiled alongside his wife after the Revolution and only became a priest after his wife's death. Being made a pastor, he happened to have a chance encounter with Napoleon at the height of the emperor's power. When Napoleon asked Myriel "Who is this good man looking at me?" Myriel, then a parson, simply replied, "Sire, you are looking at a good man, and I at a great man. Each of us may profit by it." He was then, under Napoleon's influence, appointed a bishop, because again, after the Concordat of 1801, Napoleon had the basic power to appoint bishops with ultimate Vatican approval. However, in 1814, toward the end of Napoleon's reign, he came to snub the emperor when he was passing through Digne, and he did not even come out of his episcopal residence to visit him. Hugo recounts that the bishop lived only on bare necessities and retreated from political and ecclesiastical advancement and lived a truly saintly life. There are a number of events that describe his sanctity, and Hugo shows a deep appreciation of basically the hagiographical tradition and in his depiction of this bishop. His only companions were his sister and his housekeeper. And again, Hugo was not a practicing Catholic, and his funeral was considered to be a great sort of secular canonization in the later 19th century. But he does show an appreciation of sanctity, even if he himself, in his personal life, did not live in accordance to those ideals. The fictional bishop in Les Miserables is almost certainly inspired by the true events of Bishop Benvenu de Milieu, who lived from 1753 to 1843, and excuse my no doubt imprecise French pronunciation. He was the bishop of Digne, the exact city, from 1805 to 1838. Paying great attention to his own episcopal duties and parishes, Milieu also did not seek episcopal advancement or career advancement, and he famously took in a convict named Pierre Maurin, which, as we can see, is almost certainly the inspiration for the Bishop of Digne in Les Miserables. This is, in fact, a painting of the historical bishop who is currently being investigated for beatification. And this is the casting of the same bishop in Les Miserables, Bishop Myriel. So clearly the casting of the 2012 movie seems to be inspired by the actual historical figure. The 2012 movie, if you were to compare obviously the original book with the musical, which it's world famous and everything, to the 2012 movie, I would even argue the 2012 movie takes the most efforts to really be saturated with Catholic themes. The book does as well, as we talked about, ironically, as Hugo was not considered a very Catholic person, but the 2012 movie really dives deeply into the Catholic themes of the story. So it's definitely a great movie. So in the musical, Valjean is introduced first, not the bishop. And he's introduced in the opening scene as an indentured servant or convict, and we know from the book that he is a convict at the Bonnier of Toulon. And the Bonnier of Toulon was actually the land-based successor to what in medieval times was the galley slave system. So in medieval times, convicts would be sentenced to slavery in the galleys, which is the bottom of a rowing naval ship, where convicts were used as forced labor for the naval arsenal. They would also, in the early modern period, naval galleys were no longer required as sailing technology became more efficient. So there wasn't really a need to have convicts rowing naval ships. Instead, though, they would continue to use them as slave labor. And the Bonnier of Toulon was a prison/naval fortress in southern France where convicts, such as the fictional Jean Valjean, would have repaired ships, would have cut stone, hauled materials, made rope and sails, and maintained the port. And that's what you see very clearly in the opening of the 2012 movie, is during the Look Down song. So in the lyrics of that iconic Look Down song, we hear Jean Valjean's backstory. So Inspector Javert, who is releasing him on parole, who seems to have a very immediate relationship with him in the musical and in the movie, but not as much in the book, although he was a guard at Toulon. Javert sings, "You robbed a house." Valjean says, "I broke a window pane, and I stole a loaf of bread." He says, "My sister's child was close to death. We were starving." Javert cuts him off. "You will starve again unless you learn the meaning of the law." Valjean says, "I know the meaning of those 19 years a slave of the law." Javert says, "5 years for what you did, the rest because you tried to run." And then that's the basic explanation of his story. So Valjean was thrown in prison for stealing a loaf of bread, but he keeps emphasizing all I did was steal a loaf of bread, and in reality, he did break into a house. He broke a window pane. That's very dangerous. That's not good behavior. So yeah, he deserved prison sentence for that. But Hugo is certainly not a fan of the system of imprisonment, this sort of indentured slavery, this in places like the Bonnier of Toulon. And most of France was not happy with this system either. Most of France was looking to reform the prison system, as we'll talk about. That's a big part of early 19th century French history, is this desire for penal reform. But he tried to escape on 3 different occasions, and that's why he ended up in prison for 19 years for the crime of breaking and entering and stealing a loaf of bread. As Valjean is on parole and he's leaving the Bonnier of Toulon, and he's kind of walking through the wilderness in the movie, he sings, "Never forget the years, the wastes, nor forgive them for what they've done. They are the guilty, everyone." So certainly very spiritually immature here, not repentant. And that's why he obviously kept trying to run, because he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He refused to acknowledge it's bad to break a window pane and steal a loaf of bread. There are other ways to get bread, There's other ways to get bread besides breaking people's window panes and stealing their food out of their kitchen. Obviously, if that happened to you, you would not be very happy. He then says, "The day begins, and now let's see what this new world will do for me." And you see again his spiritual immaturity at the beginning of the story, singing, "What this world will do for me," which is not the right outlook to have, but that's the outlook he has towards life and towards the world. So a bit about that prison system in history. After the Revolution, French criminal justice underwent only superficial changes from the older medieval corrective measures used by the monarchy. Medieval practices, such as administrative warrants, in which either the king or a royal administrator would simply issue a warrant without any sort of due process, and punishments such as public branding, galley sentences, as we talked about, working the galleys of a ship, or working on naval land fortresses as slaves to repair ships, and chained convict transports and forced labor remained the main courses of punishment for convicts during the Napoleonic years. The 19th century system continued to rely upon indentured servitude imprisonment, and then after a prisoner was released, they were put under police supervision, which is the exact sort of monitoring of prisoners that we saw Jean Valjean was struggling with and unable to find work after being released from prison. In Les Miserables, Valjean was imprisoned in the Bonnier of Toulon from 1796 to 1815. One of the guards, Javert, noticed his nearly inhuman strength during this time, and that becomes a key plot point throughout the story. By the 1820s and 1830s, officials and reformers discussed whether prisons could be made more orderly and corrective in focus rather than merely utilitarian by using convicts' physical strength for slave labor. They began to implement classification of criminals into different categories based on their crimes, and incorporated religious instruction and contemplative silence and closer prisoner supervision. This inspired Alexis de Tocqueville, which is someone you should be familiar with if you're a student at all of American history, and Gustave de Beaumont to be sent to the United States in 1831 to study the American use of solitary confinement in its prisons. Solitary confinement was seen as the most effective way to inspire reflection and correction in the so-called legally challenged convicts. But Alexis de Tocqueville was more interested in studying American democracy, famously, and only marginally interested in the actual reason he was sent to the United States. Toulon is here, and then this is where Digne is, where Jean Valjean ultimately ends up in Les Miserables. Once he was released, he was incapable of finding decent work because whenever he presented his identification documents, he had to present his so-called yellow passport, which designated him both as a convict imprisoned for 19 years and as a dangerous man, which of course he was dangerous because of his great strength, but he wasn't exactly a violent person while in prison. But because he had that designation on his yellow passport, he was unable to find work or even an inn to stay at. Destitute and unprotected from the autumn's cold, Valjean ultimately knocked on the bishop's door. In the 2012 movie adaptation, the bishop found him near a bench while out serving the poor, but that's just an adaptation in the movie. The bishop had a place set for him at once at his table, and he enjoyed a warm bed to sleep in that night in the episcopal palace. That night, however, Valjean rose to steal the bishop's store of silverware, but was quickly caught and brought back before the bishop's feet. That brings us to one of the more moving sequences in the musical, which we're going to quote at length here. It's called The Bishop's Song and then Jean Valjean's Soliloquy. here we have the lyrics of John Valjean's song to himself as he's contemplating whether or not he will steal the silver. He sings, "He let me eat my fill, I had the lion's share. The silver in my hand cost twice what I had earned in all those 19 years, that lifetime of despair, and yet he trusted me. The old fool trusted me, he'd done his bit of good. I played the grateful serf, and I thanked him like I should. And when the house was still, I got up in the night, took the silver, took my flight." And then he stole his silver, and that leads us to the decisive moment in the opening of the play, in the first act, when the constables take John Valjean. They discover him quickly. Of course, they're monitoring him. They know he's in the city. They know he's in the bishop's house, so they're trying to keep a close eye on him. And they bring him back to the bishop with the silver. They say, "Tell his reverence your story. Let's see if he's impressed. You were lodging here last night. You were the honest bishop's guest. And then out of Christian goodness, when he learned about your plight, you maintained he made a present of the silver." And then the bishop answers, "That is right." So the bishop then says, "In fact, I did make a present of this silver." The bishop then, in this song, sings, "But my friend, you left so early, surely something slipped your mind. You forgot I gave these also, would you leave the best behind?" And he hands Valjean 2 massive silver candlesticks. And so even though John Valjean robbed him, the bishop gives him these massive candlesticks as well. The constables know what the bishop's doing here, but they can't really do anything about it. And he looks to the constables and he says, "So, messieurs, you may release him, for this man has spoken true. I commend you for your duty, and God's blessing go with you." He then gives them the bishop's blessing. The bishop then turns to Valjean and he sings these words, "But remember this, my brother, see in this some higher plan. You must use this precious silver to become an honest man. By the witness of the martyrs, by the passion and the blood, God has raised you out of darkness. I have bought your soul for God." In the 2012 movie, the bishop then blesses him in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and you can see he's kneeling and he has tears forming in his eyes. And now he has to make a decision. Is he going to use this silver the bishop's giving him to become an honest man or not? We saw he was not very spiritually mature. He was not merely a victim of circumstance. That would be an improper interpretation of his character at the beginning of the story. He did steal. He did break into a home. He did say, "They're the guilty, everyone, never forgive them." And he did say, "What this world will do for me." He did steal the silver. He's not a perfect person. But now he has to decide, what is he going to do with this incredible mercy shown to him? And that's where we get Valjean's soliloquy, which is my favorite song of the whole musical. So we'll read his whole soliloquy. This is him deciding what to do, which fittingly, in the 2012 movie, this whole soliloquy is sung in a single take, which makes it all the more moving. And it's done in a chapel in the cathedral. And you're going to see in the movie, the 2012 movie, whenever he's contemplating turning toward God and actually indeed like accepting that the bishop had bought his soul for God, he's looking at a crucifix and he's praying. But then whenever he starts to contemplate rejecting that mercy and that grace, he gets up and he starts walking away from the crucifix. But then he turns back again and he keeps being open to the grace, and then he turns away again. And there's that tension, until it's finally resolved. So let's read through the whole soliloquy here. "What have I done, sweet Jesus? What have I done? Become a thief in the night, become a dog on the run. Have I fallen so far, and is the hour so late, that nothing remains but the cry of my hate, the cries in the dark that nobody hears, here where I stand at the turning of the years? If there's another way to go, I missed it 20 long years ago. My life was a war that could never be won. They gave me a number, and they murdered Valjean when they chained me and left me for dead, just for stealing a mouthful of bread. Yet why?" And then here he starts to really break down. The music softens in the musical, and he really starts to gaze upon the Lord. He sings, "Yet why did I allow this man to touch my soul and teach me love? He treated me like any other. He gave me his trust. He called me brother. My life he claims for God above. Can such things be? For I had come to hate the world, this world that always hated me." And then he stands up and he starts walking the other direction. In the movie, at least, he says, "Take an eye for an eye, turn your heart into stone. This is all I have lived for. This is all I have known." But then he turns around, he starts facing the cross again, and he sings, "One word from him and I'd be back, beneath the lash upon the rack. Instead, he offers me my freedom. I feel my shame inside me like a knife. He told me that I have a soul. How does he know? What spirit comes to move my life? Is there another way to go? I am reaching, but I fall, and the night is closing in." And here he's nearly sort of falling to despair again, that there's really no hope for him. "As I stare into the void, to the whirlpool of my sin, I'll escape now from that world, from the world of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean is nothing now. Another story must begin." Now, a cool touch again in the 2012 movie is that here, when he says, "escape now from that world," he actually gets up, he leaves that little chapel, he heads out into what seems to be the back of the Episcopal Palace, and he's in a graveyard, as you can see in the picture here. And it's in that graveyard that he says, "Jean Valjean is nothing now. Another story must begin." Really symbolizing his death to self, that the director put in a graveyard, showing that here he's dying to self. Jean Valjean is nothing now. He's escaping from that world of his whirlpool of sin by the help of grace and, of course, the literal, money. Then we're introduced to this character, Fantine. Fantine first appeared in the narrative in Paris of 1817. She is a young woman there attached to a circle of young students. The leader of the men that she's accompanying is named Felix Tholomyès. He is a wealthy and a quite unserious student from Toulouse, and his companions consort with Fantine and her friends. Fantine is quite young, quite impressionable, and quite taken with the affection she receives from this young man, and ultimately she falls for him. She surrenders her innocence to him. In the "I Dreamed a Dream" song, the Fantine sings, he took my childhood in his stride, and trusting him completely. Ultimately, he and the other men abandon the woman as a joke after an outing, and she later discovers that she is with child, and she's not able to get him to be in the picture at all. And so she's left raising this child all by herself, and her dream of this romance with this young man is shattered because he was only interested in a little bit of pleasure while half-heartedly engaging in his studies, showing great moral rot on universities back in the early 1800s. She made great sacrifices to raise Cosette. However, the burdens of being an unmarried mother in this cultural and economic situation became unbearable. She ended up hoping to return to her hometown to find a good, stable employment, but she realized she would not be able to because of the scandal that would be caused by her being an unwed mother. And during this period, she ends up discovering Madame Thénardier, or Thénardier is like the English way people say it, who runs an inn with her husband, and they have two little girls already, Eponine and Azelma. And there, Fantine sees how happy the girls seem playing outside, and she begs Madame Thénardier to basically take Cosette in for a certain amount of payment, and that's how she begins to send this remittance for her daughter, who is now going to be raised by the Thénardiers in their inn. If you're familiar with the musical, that's of course that Master of the House song introduces their inn. Now, back to Valjean. After leaving D. he ends up arriving in Montreal-sur-Mer at the end of 1815, the same year that Fantine conceived, under the name Madeleine. He first attracted a lot of public attention by rescuing two children from a fire. Because he rescued those children from a fire, he was not questioned further about his background, and he is ultimately able to become integrated into the economic life of this town. The town has a imitation jet and black glass ornament or bead industry, but he is able to make the industry much more profitable by improving its methods and reducing costs. And by being such a great innovator, he ends up running his own factory, greatly increasing the prosperity of the city. He ends up using some of his extra finances to fund schools, hospital beds, an infant school, a dispensary, and relief for old or injured workers. And because of all these great efforts and good works, he ends up being nominated mayor by his fellow townsmen by 1819. He refused at first, but became the mayor of the city in 1820. And Fantine would ultimately be employed in his factory. Some would say that his factory was actually producing rosaries. We know for certain that they produced beads. It's possible that those beads were in fact used for rosaries. The Thénardiers at Montfermeil continued to demand increasing amounts of money from Cosette. For Cosette, meanwhile, and usually pretending that she was sick, Fantine took them at their word, and she continually sent them whatever she could from her wages. But her secret past and her, active fornication with the father of Cosette ends up becoming known, and as a result, she is dismissed from her factory, and the factory forewoman dismissed her without first consulting Madeleine or Valjean. From Fantine's perspective, she blamed Madeleine for her ruin. Without steady work, she began to try to survive however she could. She at first tried to just, do some sewing work, but the pay was too low. Ultimately, she ends up selling her hair for 10 francs. She sold systematically each of her teeth for more funds, but ultimately the Thénardiers began to demand more and more and more, and ultimately she totally sold herself entirely, entering into prostitution. So it shows this very believable and collapse from Fantine, who you feel very sympathetic towards. Yes, she did make a mistake, but she was trying to be the best mother she could after making that mistake, and it's just she's completely out of options to really provide for her child in this situation where she is being preyed upon by Thénardier, and she's being identified entirely with her mistake early in life. Now, Javert ends up becoming the inspector of the city, Montreal-sur-Mer. He is sent as its head inspector after working for many years as a guard in the prison that we talked about earlier. And he had some relationship with Jean Valjean, and he immediately began to suspect that this mayor of Montreal-sur-Mer may have been the Valjean that he remembered and who he knew had begun to skip parole. This suspicion sharpened after Fauchelevent, an old carter, was trapped beneath an overturned cart, and Valjean was able to lift the cart himself, showing almost inhuman strength, especially for his age. This seemed to confirm to Javert that this man was in fact the almost superhuman former prisoner, and that strength, of course, it's a part of his the symbolism of this character of Jean Valjean. He has this incredible strength despite all the hardships he undergoes. Now, one Madeleine overruled Javert in the matter of arresting Fantine for prostitution. Javert reported his suspicions to the higher authorities, but he then came to ask Madeleine or Valjean to dismiss him from his post because he then believed he had falsely accused Madeleine of being Jean Valjean when Jean Valjean was supposedly discovered going under the name of Champmathieu, who was an old man who was arrested for stealing apples, and then because of his physical resemblance to Valjean, was identified as Valjean and was sentenced to essentially life in prison for himself because he was given the charges of escaping or not being faithful to his parole. So he was in prison for stealing apples, but then he was in prison for life because it was assumed that he was Jean Valjean. And that's where we lead to this song, Who Am I? And Who Am I? In the movie, you see Valjean is deciding whether or not he's going to turn himself in and admit that he is Jean Valjean, or if he's just going to let this other man who stole these apples to simply rot in prison in his place. You see him making this decision before a crucifix in the movie. Again, beautiful Catholic imagery, as well as before the silver candlesticks. The silver candlesticks become a huge part of the movie. You constantly see him reflecting before them. So let's read this song too. We're not going to do this through the entire story, just kind of the beginning. But he thought that man was me without a second glance. That stranger he has found, this man could be my chance. His chance to just be off the hook and not need to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life anymore. Why should I save his hide? Why should I right this wrong, when I have come so far and struggled for so long? If I speak, I am condemned. If I stay silent, I am damned. obviously damned, as in this would be a grave mortal sin to let this other man rot in his place. And then he starts to justify, not turning himself in and just living the rest of his life a free man. He says, I am the master of hundred of workers, they all look to me. How can I abandon them? How would they live if I am not free? If I speak, they are condemned. If I stay silent, I am damned. Who am I? Can I condemn this man to slavery? Pretend I do not feel his agony. This innocent who wears my face, who goes to judgment in my place. Who am I? Can I conceal myself forevermore? Pretend I'm not the man I was before? And must my name until I die be no more than an alibi? Must I lie? How can I ever face my fellow man? How can I ever face myself again? My soul belongs to God, I know. I made that bargain long ago. He gave me hope when hope was gone. He gave me strength to journey on. And then in the musical, he transitions to being before the court. He's turning himself in. He says, Who am I? Who am I? I am Jean Valjean. And then he reveals his chest. He says, And so, Javert, you see it's true. This man bears no more guilt than you. Who am I? 24601. And then he, so turns himself in. Now, he ends up in the book, he turns himself in at Arras, not directly before Javert, but before a judge. And then he made arrangements to, before he turned himself in, he actually made arrangements in the book to hide much of his fortune. Most of his fortune was concealed in the woods near Montfermeil, but so he could re-access it. His plan was to eventually escape from prison again, though he had to basically leave a lot of his fortune in the bank under his official name, because if none of his fortune was left behind, then it would be obvious that he had done something with it. After making his confession, he returned to Montreuil-sur-Mer, where he found Fantine dying under the care he had arranged for her after intervening in her arrest. And it's very specific that in the movie that this is under the care of religious sisters. Fantine still believed that he would bring back Cosette, but he was arrested, and Fantine died without seeing her daughter. Valjean was then confined. In the play, in the musical, he escapes, and he doesn't actually get arrested by Javert. In the book, he does get arrested. He briefly escaped after being initially confined in a little jail cell. He recovered what he could from his room, including the bishop's candlesticks, but he was able to bury these to find them again later, but was later captured again. He was sent back to the Bonnier of Toulon as a returned convict and would likely be there, presumably, for the rest of his life. But in 1823, while assigned to the ship Orion, he rescued a sailor who had fallen into danger on the rigging, and after this heroic act, he fell into the sea and was believed to be drowned, but in reality, he had escaped again. Once free, he returned to Montfermeil, where he found the Thénardiers inn, and he was able to rescue Cosette after recovering his fortune. He arrived there on Christmas Eve of 1823, so Cosette is about 7 or 8 years old. By this time, after the payments had stopped, Cosette was reduced to a servant in the household, while Eponine and Azelma were, of course, being very doted upon and spoiled. Thénardier is a symbol of a base vice. He ultimately accepted Valjean's money, greatly overcharging him for what Fantine owed, and also for alleged medical expenses. But once he realized Valjean's great wealth, he was ashamed, and his wife had made him feel ashamed for not requesting more money, and that became an obsession for Thénardier for the rest of his life, trying to find Jean Valjean and extort more money out of him for Cosette, even though he wasn't actually owed any of that. He followed, from this point, Thénardier carried a lasting resentment toward Valjean. Valjean then brought Cosette to Paris, and they lived quietly under assumed names for some time, but their acts of charity were too loud, and they did attract the attention of Javert, who was hunting him down and did not believe that he had in fact died in the Bonnier de Toulon. There's this dramatic chase scene that's in the book where Javert is chasing Jean Valjean through the city, and ultimately Valjean has to scale a wall, and then he pulls Cosette up, and that's in the book, and it's in the movie. It's not in the musical because it's just too hard to really put into a stage. Now, in both the movie and the book, they then go over the wall and they descend into a convent, an extremely austere convent. And in the movie, that's just a momentary kind of passing through the convent. Now, that same man, Fauchelevent, the carter that Valjean had saved by lifting the cart off of him, ends up being the new groundskeeper of the convent, of this extremely austere order. So he actually, in the movie, he just kind of helps Valjean escape, but in the book, he actually takes Valjean and Cosette in. Now, um, in the book, it's specified that this entire religious order has formed to do atonement for an act of desecration of the Holy Eucharist. So it's just filled with nuns who are giving their entire lives of penance in reparation for one act of desecration against the Holy Eucharist. So that shows the great Eucharistic piety that Hugo appreciated. And also in the book, there's this great epic scene where a sister dies, but she wants to be buried underneath the in the actual convent, but the French government didn't allow that, so they wanted to just like have an empty coffin go out into the cemetery so that the authorities would think that the sister was being buried out in the cemetery, but they actually used this opportunity to put Valjean in the coffin and then sneak him out, and but then they were going to like have him enter licitly because you can't just have a guy randomly show up in the convent. But then he accidentally almost got buried alive, and so it's a crazy scene. But ultimately, he didn't get buried alive, and he does re-enter the convent, and he does. They live there until Cosette approaches womanhood, and she's just kind of living as a boarder in the convent. And it's presumed that Valjean is the brother of Fauchelevent. So that's the name he carries for the rest of the book. Meanwhile, in the Marais quarter of Paris, Marius Pontmercy was born in the year 1810 into a divided political patrimony because his maternal grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand, lived in a very wealthy area and raised Marius to be a royalist, and he was a fervent royalist. And he was the only parent that Marius ever knew, or guardian that he ever knew, because his mother and his father had both died young. No, sorry, his father had not died. But Marius was not allowed to see his father because Gillenormand told Marius that his father was basically a scoundrel. He ends up discovering that his father was actually Colonel Georges Pontmercy and had served under Napoleon, was wounded at Waterloo, and lived in retirement afterwards. So Gillenormand despised him because he served Napoleon, and Gillenormand was a royalist. He kept Marius away from him, but eventually Marius did discover his father. He discovered that his father was secretly watching him at church, and he also discovered that his father had been saved from Thénardier, and so he had this eternal debt of gratitude, and that just creates some interesting tension later in the story. I'm not going to go through every little detail of the story. It is over 1,000 pages long, generally. Marius ends up leaving his grandfather behind because he feels his grandfather has robbed him of a relationship with his father. He ends up associating with a group of Republicans, those in favor of a republic in Paris, a group called the Friends of the ABC. This group's name, ABC in French, was similar to the word the abased. These were a group of students or members of the student life in Paris, not necessarily students, but associates of students, who were in favor of establishing a new republic. Their official function was to help with the education of children, but that's not really what they did. Enjolras was the leader of the group, but Courfeyrac was Marius's friend who introduced him to the group. Marius was content with these friends, although he was more so aligned with a Bonapartist or Napoleonic kind of vision for a state, but he wasn't really very ideological in the first place. His entire he was really just devoted to his father in general, and he was kind of devoted to these friends too, but he wasn't really overtly political. He was more just interested in his relationships with his father. He wanted to honor him, but he also wanted to honor these friends, and he also ultimately falls in love with Cosette, and that becomes a driving force for him. Now, the revolutionary flag used by Enjolras in Les Miserables was a bright red flag with nothing else on it. What exactly is the history of that red flag? So during the French Revolution, as well as before, a red flag might be waved in order to signal that the state or the city government was going to use lethal force to suppress civil disorder. So it was a way of basically declaring martial law, that civil order or civil liberties have been suspended, and that assemblies would be dispersed using lethal force. The red flag was famously used on July 17th, 1791, at the Champ de Mars, when Mayor Jean-Sylvain Bailly declared martial law, and his National Guard fired upon a Republican crowd that had gathered to petition against King Louis XVI after his flights to Versailles. Now, the flag initially was used as a warning to civilians, but it was quickly taken as a flag to symbolize the revolutionary cause in general. And revolutionaries, republicanists, and then later just more social radicals used the bright red flag as a symbol of the blood shed by the people against corrupt regimes. During the 1848 revolutions, which would later, after the events of Les Miserables, spread throughout Europe, many radicals used the red flag because of its connection to the revolutionaries of the French Revolution. Moderate Republicans in France typically favored the tricolor flag, but radical socialist groups in France and then beyond came to identify most with this bright red flag. Ultimately, the red flag would, of course, become the backdrop of all communist flags. So the communist red flag does go back to the French Revolution. There's also this interesting character, Gavroche. He is actually, in the book, the neglected child of Thénardier, who we've talked about. He sort of becomes a very prominent symbol of the little people, or the commoners of France. He lived in the decaying wood and plaster elephant, which was a sort of leftover monument of the Napoleonic period. So basically, Napoleon eventually wanted this monument you see here, which had a staircase within, which was going to eventually become an observatory tower. He hoped that it would be eventually covered in bronze, but it never really was. It was 78 feet high, but by the 1830s, it was starting to rot, and it was a symbol of the sort of decadence of the Napoleonic period. So, Hugo makes use of that symbol, and that's where he has Gavroche sort of live. Now, in Hugo's own epilogue, at least to the volume that I own, he said something along the lines of, the characters in this story become larger than just characters. And I think that's certainly true, and it's worth just talking about each of the characters here. And then that'll kind of wrap up our examination of Les Miserables. I don't want to give away every last, detail of it. It's a good book. You should read it. So beginning with the bishop, we've talked a lot about him already. He's a symbol of just a pious bishop who's just concerned with being a pastor, and is certainly saintly because of it, because he fulfills his duties with lots of devotion and piety, and he's not involved in careerism. Jean Valjean we've talked a lot about as well. He goes through this, he's obviously the protagonist of the story. He goes through this spiritual arc where he begins being aggrieved, rightly or wrongly, and a little bit of both for wrongs done to him, but he's also got moral faults of his own. And then he begins to appreciate, because he received mercy, he begins to appreciate not only his relationship with God, but the need to be just, the need to be industrious. But then when he promises to Fantine that he will help her child, when he discovers the plight of her child, he then moves from living a life oriented around justice to living a life oriented around charity. And towards the end of the story, he needs to learn to even surrender his attachment to his adopted daughter and make great sacrifices in order to help her eventually have a life of her own. And he moves her out of the safety of the convent so that she can he doesn't want to force her to be a nun, because if he stays in the convent, she'll certainly be a nun. He wants to allow her to make that choice more freely. And then he makes great sacrifices to ultimately help save Marius's life once he realizes the two of them are in love. Fantine is a symbol of someone who did make a mistake, but was just at least utterly circumstantially unable to really rise above that mistake ever, and so that's that. But she shows tireless devotion to her daughter. Eponine is the eldest daughter of Thénardier and Madame Thénardier. She ends up having this obsession, this sort of like worship-like obsession of Marius, which kind of shows us, for her, she was raised in the squalor and vice of her parents' household. She was spoiled excessively by her parents as a kid, but then because she was so spoiled, she ends up having extremely low self-esteem, you might say, or a low self-image, because she was never raised to see her own dignity or her own potential as a human. She was just raised very indulgently, and then as a result of that, she doesn't really appreciate the full depth of her soul because she's raised so indulgently. When she encounters Marius, who treats her with a bit of kindness and is dignified, she begins to completely obsess over him to the point where she loses her dignity and she sort of like adores him, worships him, and that's a result of her poor understanding of her own human dignity. Hugo, not a fan of the Monsieur Gillenormand, the grandfather of Marius. He's not a fan of the royalist perspective. He sees it as backward looking. He also rightly points out that the royalists, not too infrequently, were very decadent in themselves. You can kind of see it all in this image here. The royalist perspective kind of longing for a return to the mid 18th century decadence and indulgence of the late the late Ancien regime. It was certainly not morally upstanding, and that's a big reason for its ultimate downfall was for its decadence. Javert is a person who's utterly oriented around law and order. If you see the musical or the movie, he's motivated by a fundamentalist, sort of moralist view inspired by his faith, his religiosity. In the book, his religiosity is definitely not a theme. And he makes one comment about, like, God himself couldn't stop me from doing this. Some have said he's an atheist. I'm not sure that's exactly clear in the book, but I don't really think that's supported by the text. But regardless, his rigidity is not really a extension of his faith explicitly in the book. It's more just he's a very rigid person, and he's almost not appreciating I don't know, the full humanity of his subjects. At the very end of the story, basically after he hunts down Jean Valjean throughout his life, Jean Valjean ends up coming face to face with him in the barricades of the 1832 June Rebellion. Jean Valjean has the ability to kill Javert, but he goes, actually puts himself out on a limb to actually spare Javert and allow him to go free. Because Javert is grateful for his life, later in the story, Javert is actually going to spare Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean says, look, just let me save Marius, basically, and Javert allows him. But because he compromised with his extremely rigid, moral code, it causes him to spiral. And he then sings this song that's mirrors the exact words of Jean Valjean's soliloquy when he decides whether or not he'll take his life. And just like Jean Valjean, in his soliloquy saying, escape now from that world of Jean Valjean, Javert would sing, escape now from that world of Jean Valjean, because the world that he now lives in doesn't make sense, where, he felt like the thing he morally had to do was let Jean Valjean escape, at least temporarily, because he felt like he had to do that and compromise with his extremely rigid, law and order mentality. That's what ultimately makes him think life is not worth living anymore. Enjolras, the leader of the revolutionary group, kind of symbolizes that youthful ideological drive, which can lead youths to do extreme things. And obviously his organizing of a stupid failed rebellion is an example of a stupid thing that a high school or college age kid would do, driven so much by ideology, sort of floating around in ideology la la land rather than in real pragmatic reality. And Thénardier, as we said, is really a symbol of just unbridled vice. That's kind of what his character symbolizes. So, all right. So let me know what you think about that story in the comments. I think it's important to know that the Jean Valjean thing. It's not all convicts are Jean Valjean. There was tragically a French pastor who invited an immigrant into his cathedral, and after the immigrant had tried to burn down the entire cathedral, and then after he invited him into his home, the guy stabbed him to death. So it's okay, it didn't work out like the Jean Valjean story. And there's a place for mercy, and it's really important. It's essential that people are given second chances, and we attempt to rehabilitate, but you also have to have a pragmatic approach to policy, and you have to recognize that oftentimes rehabilitation is not going to happen. It's not like every single person will be rehabilitated if given the right circumstances. There are some people that truly do just choose vice and squalor. Okay, so that's the end of the Les Miserables study, but now let's go from there into, the rest of modern French history, especially the 1832 June Rebellion. That is kind of the main subject of that conclusion of the Les Miserables story, is that great, barricade, that rebellion that Enjolras led. So the 1832 rebellion was really an extension of the July Revolution of 1830. That revolution removed Charles X and the Senior Bourbon line, but instead of establishing a new republic, it placed Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, on the throne as the King of the French. Many Republicans consider this a failed revolution because one monarchy had been replaced with another, and even if the new monarchy was more constitutional, it was not a republic. France was also under intense economic strain after the revolt of 1830. From 1827 to 1832, there were many harvest problems and food shortages and a rising cost of living. In December of 1831, the Canut revolt of silk workers in Laon showed that labor unrest could break out into open violence, and in early 1832, Paris was struck by a severe cholera epidemic, which killed thousands and intensified suspicion, fear, and resentment among the poor. The immediate occasion for the ultimate 1832 rebellion was the death of a general, General Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, who you hear referenced in the musical. Lamarck had been a general under Napoleon, and he had been a critic of the July monarchy, instituted after the July Revolution. He supported liberal and nationalist causes. He died of cholera on June 1st, 1832. His funeral on June 5th drew thousands into the streets, and this became a political demonstration which eventually erupted into a riot, and that's what we see happen in the musical. Anti-monarchist Republicans seized parts of central and eastern Paris, and they built various barricades, especially in the districts between Châtelet, the Arsenal, and Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The fighting lasted for 1 day, so it did not make a lasting difference, but it certainly made an impact on Victor Hugo, who decided to make it sort of the climax of his story. After this failed uprising in 1832, the July monarchy, which followed the 1830 revolution, remained in power. They continued to face opposition, and there was continued unrest for the remaining decade. By the 1840s, François Gouzul had become the central minister of the July monarchy, and his government resisted efforts to broaden the electorate, which was still limited by property qualifications. You had to own a certain amount of land in order to vote. When the government prohibited a major banquet planned for February of 1848, demonstrations and then revolts broke out alongside other revolutions throughout all of Europe in 1848. It was the great year of revolutions, ultimately causing the monarchy to collapse, giving way to the Second Republic. The Second Republic introduced universal male suffrage, expanding the electorate from 200,000 men to several million, and briefly experimented with a number of social reforms. The Second Republic ultimately would give way to a second empire, however, when Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was Napoleon III, was elected president. In 1851, he would carry out a coup, and in 1852, the Second Republic would then give way to an empire after the French people voted in favor of that social reform. So, in the final video here, I'm going to post another video soon, which will overview the Second Empire of Napoleon III. It will then talk about the French intervention in Mexico, which is related to the Cinco de Mayo celebration, and the temporary, short-lived Mexican Empire led by Maximilian I. We'll talk about France in the Franco-Prussian War against the Prussians and the Germans, French missionary efforts, French Catholicism in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. We'll talk about how France continued to secularize, World War I, World War II, and a look at France today. That will be in the final video. Let's conclude in prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostri. Amen. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thank you so much for watching. May the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your mind anything I've said unfaithful to him or untrue. And God bless you all. Please leave your comments. Talk to you next time. Bye.